Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with new reference recordings, the thought experiment to try to determine, if there ever could be a consensus again, what the reference recordings would be for iconic works. And this is going to be a pretty limited series, I think, because it's hard to determine exactly how such a consensus might form. But there has to be a concatenation of the following factors, as we mentioned in our discussion of Beethoven cycles: excellence in performance and recorded sound, of course, and all of that stuff; marketing and promotion that allows people to, actually hear the music, have access to it; length of stay in the catalog that also allows people to have access to it; and, and then other certain environmental factors, which we'll talk about if they become necessary. But that's what we're looking for. It's a combination of things, of the ability of people to listen and form an opinion. And, the marketing and promotion element, even though the classical music industry does virtually nothing these days, is really very important. Just the fact that something stays available is extremely important. And so, I've done talks on, the best Brahms symphony cycles. And there are many candidates that are relatively recent because Brahms has always fared very well. Everybody records him. I mean, everybody who has an orchestra. And so there's lots of choice. And a lot of people play the music quite well because there are two sort of broad ways you can do it. You can do it in the romantic schmoozy way, or you can do it in the more austere classicizing way. One group that has done Brahms, which absolutely sucks, is the period instrument people. Their Brahms is almost universally bad. And it's kind of interesting because I take Schoenberg's view in Brahms the Progressive, that his music is actually not that suitable to the strictures of the period instrument movement, at least as they exist today, which are totally modern. They have nothing to do with what really happened back at the time. You have to remember that. And we do know that Brahms had, his Meiningen period where, he used that little orchestra that stood up and they had like 20 people in it. And, he was played by smaller forces. And they're beautiful cycles with smaller forces that adopt what people think is that style. Charles Mackerras first among them, actually. The style that was continued by Hermann Abendroth. But we know a few things about Brahms. We know that he preferred large orchestras whenever he could get them. And that, at the end of the day, however classical his approach to form was when it came to symphonies, he was a romantic composer who wrote gorgeous lyrical themes, and he expected big, expressive string sections that, played that way. And so the period instrument people, with their tinny little instruments and tiny ensembles and vibrato strings, just aren't Brahms. I don't care what anybody says. I mean, the music itself, I think, militates against that approach. So we're not going to have to deal with the period instrument people when it comes to Brahms. So that means we're talking about really well-established forces that are out there, that are a fairly obvious choice in many respects. And a couple of you have mentioned it. For me, the major candidates for new reference recording in the Brahms symphonies would be either James Levine or Claudio Abbado. James Levine's Brahms, I think, is just some of the greatest stuff anybody ever did. But there are two major problems with James Levine as the choice. First, he did two cycles, one on RCA with Chicago, the other on Deutsche Grammophon with Vienna. And they tend to cancel each other out. They're both splendid. They really are. They're absolutely glorious, wonderful Brahms performances with no weak links whatsoever. I mean, it's like he's channeling his inner George Sell. So they are musically just about flawless. They really are. They're wonderful, wonderful performances in that classicizing sort of style that Zell favored and that Levine favored in doing Brahms. Beautiful, beautiful performances. But like I said, the two cycles sort of cancel each other out. And the second issue, which is practically the more important of the two, is that Levine's whole career tanked at the end of his life because of the accusations of sexual impropriety and his reputations in the doldrums. And so when your reputation is gone to the dogs, there's not much you can do about a consensus forming. around the excellence of your work because nobody's going to promote it. Nobody's pushing Levine these days. And I really am very curious to see what happens, or if he somehow becomes rehabilitated, because he passed away. You know, these other people who've had similar issues, like Charles Dutoit and Daniela Gatti and whatnot, you know, they can come back because they're still around. They're still around, and there are people willing to forgive and forget. And so you never know what's going to happen. And of course, it depends on whether or not there's ongoing legal action and whatnot. But Levine is dead. And so there's no one promoting the cause anymore. He can't do it himself. And he was very sick in his last years and was a shadow of his former self, you know, interpretively, artistically. So that's an issue. It's really, really an issue. And that leaves Abbado by default. Now, Claudio Abbado, as some of you may know, is a conductor who I have real issues with because I think his work has been extremely patchy. He tends to be an interventionist micromanager in many cases. He's done wonderful things. Don't get me wrong. He's done amazing things. But in Europe, you know, there was largely a feeling that he could do no wrong because he had the Berlin Philharmonic, and he had La Scala at one point. He had, you know, he had much of musical Europe at his beck and call, and he had the huge promotional machine that ensured that everything he did would be worshipped, whether it was good or whether it sucked, particularly in Italy, where he was, you know, a god. So it's very, very difficult to form a distanced, objective impression of his work, most of which was, you know, I mean, it was, like I said, highly variable. He did his best work in London when he was younger. He did, there are boxes of his stuff in Vienna, boxes of his stuff in Berlin, boxes and boxes in Chicago. He did boxes of stuff. He did some amazing opera recordings and some fabulous orchestral recordings. But I think we can all agree that the apex of his work as an orchestral conductor, quite likely, was his Brahms in Berlin. It was an outstanding cycle and creative, imaginatively done, because you got the symphonies with all the short choral works attached to them. He also did fabulous concertos with Gil Shaham and others. He was a wonderful, sensitive, intelligent Brahms conductor, and his performances seem to really sort of straddle the line between that more ferocious classical approach that Levine adopted and the romantic schmoozy approach that was traditional for Brahms. He didn't, unlike his Beethoven, where he tried to do a sort of period instrument-y thing, he never did that with Brahms. He accepted the performance traditions, which actually, you know, people are so sort of short-sighted when it comes to this. You know, Brahms stuff isn't that old. 1880s, 1890s, we're talking about for the most part, for the symphonies, 1870s to 1880s. A 20-year period that was 150-ish years ago. You know, somebody says, oh, God, it's 150 years. It's not a long time. It's 2 lifetimes. You know, if you live to be 75, which isn't actually all that long. It's 2 lifetimes. And the people who knew Brahms and played Brahms, such as Klemperer and Monteux and Walter, I mean, who knew the era, who knew the style, they've given us stereo recordings which tell us what the correct Brahms style is. So there is absolutely nothing that we can learn from, like, period instrument people or that kind of nonsense. I mean, you can only, the Brahms style is a known quantity. And so the best performances are going to work within that style. The only question, differentiation between the earlier and the later, is going to be sonic quality and, you know, the excellence of the performance within that box, within those stylistic and idiomatically effective parameters. So Ozawa works within those. I mean, Ozawa, I just did an Ozawa video. Abbado works within those parameters, and he does it beautifully, absolutely beautifully. He has, like I said, he has the reputation, although he's no longer with us. I mean, you know, there's the enormous Abbado box. I mean, he's still being actively promoted. And I think that you've got the Berlin Philharmonic. Let's not forget also, The great Brahms cycle will probably be with Berlin or Vienna or one of those groups, if you could possibly do it that way. And it's ironic that the previous reference recordings were not with Berlin or Vienna. I mean, Klemper was with the Philharmonic and Walter was with New York or the Columbia Symphony. So, it's time for the revenge of the Europeans. I mean, the reason they weren't in the earlier cycles is because those earlier reference recordings were made in the immediate wake of World War II, when the European orchestras were rebuilding. And they weren't all that great. They didn't sound so terrific as often as not, although they could still do beautiful Brahms, of course. But, they weren't the great orchestras at the time. And so they weren't promoted as such until later on in the 60s, for the most part. And so here we have Berlin Philharmonic at one of the great orchestras with one of the great modern conductors doing great Brahms. And that answers the question, what is the new reference recording? Whether you like them or not, that's not the point. This is the new reference. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.